Okay, so this is the model of the ventricles of the brain. I'm going to be spinning this around a little bit just to give you a better look at some of the structures, but we're going to start with what we call the lateral ventricles. So there's 4 ventricles of the brain. There's the lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, the 4th ventricle, and then there's the aqueduct of the midbrain. Remember, these are spaces within the brain that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is also manufactured in these places by what we call the choroid plexus. So if we look at this model, this would be a cast of the spaces. So in other words, we would have taken the spaces and injected them with a plastic, and then taken the brain away, and then this is what you're left with. So these represent those hollow or fluid-filled spaces. So the lateral ventricles are the biggest, and they're these big C-shaped structures, okay? And there are 2 of them. So there's one on the right hemisphere and one on the left hemisphere. So if we spin this around, you can look at it this way, which is a little bit different view. And you see you've got one that would be in the left hemisphere and one that would be in the right hemisphere. If we spin it this way, again, you're looking at, this would be the one that's in the left hemisphere. Now, the 3rd ventricle is basically dead center in the middle of the brain, and it sits between the right and the left thalamus, okay? So when you look at it, it looks kind of flat, and this entire structure right here is the 3rd ventricle, okay? Now, if you take a look at this model from this view, I like to say it looks like a bird with a fancy hat. And so the lateral ventricles would be the fancy hat, the 3rd ventricle would be the bird's, basically the bird's head with its eye and its beak right there. Okay, so that would be the 3rd ventricle. The 4th ventricle would be the bird's, unfortunately, little shriveled up body. Okay, so if we go down, what would be the bird's neck? I'll come back to that. And this structure right here is the 4th ventricle. And then this channel that goes between the 3rd and the 4th ventricle is what's called the aqueduct of the midbrain, or the mesencephalic aqueduct. Okay, that's a channel that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to go from the 3rd ventricle down to the 4th ventricle. The 4th ventricle then is going to empty into the central canal of the cerebrospinal, of the spinal cord. When you look at this model, you see some pink, looks like somebody took a paintbrush and just painted a little pink on those ventricles. There's some on the lateral ventricles as well. That represents the choroid plexus. Now remember, the choroid plexus is a combination of ependymal cells and capillaries, and the choroid plexus produces the cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles. The cerebral spinal fluid is found in the ventricles. It also is found in the subarachnoid space that goes around the brain as well as the spinal cord. And it's also found in the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay. One of the things that's mentioned on your sheet would be the interventricular foramen, okay, which would be a hole between the 2 lateral ventricles, and that would be this little area right here. Okay. Okay, it's also sometimes referred to as the foramen of Monro. So that's the ventricle model, and you should study that because you will definitely be tested on it.